Before you sign anything, before you say one honest word in that final meeting, understand this. The exit interview is not a formality. It's not a closing ceremony where you finally get to speak your mind on the way out. In systems I've worked inside, that conversation can quietly become part of a permanent record, one that follows you if you ever need this employer again, one that shapes how you're remembered long after your badge stops working. Before you let years of frustration spill out in that room, understand what's really happening on the other side of the table. Hey, it's Dre. I've spent years on the corporate side of this exact moment, building compensation plans, sitting in calibration sessions, watching turnover data get sliced and diced by people 3 levels above the manager you're annoyed at. So if you're the kind of person who wants to understand how this machine actually works, before you walk into it, stick around, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. Because today's topic is the exit interview and whether you should actually sit down and do one. Here's the thing about exit interviews. Most people treat them one of two ways. Either they think it's completely meaningless, a box HR checks so they can say they asked, or they think it's some kind of trap, a final test designed to catch them saying something they shouldn't. The truth sits in between those two extremes, and understanding where the line actually falls is what's going to protect you. Yes, this is real. The exit interview does matter, but not in the way most people think. So let's start with why this meeting happens in the first place. When you tender your resignation, your manager typically loops in human resources, and somewhere in your final week or two, you'll get a request to sit down for an exit interview. In most organizations I've seen from the inside, this isn't personal, and it isn't really about you specifically. It's about data. Companies track voluntary turnover the way a business tracks any other costs, because losing and replacing an employee is expensive. Recruiting, onboarding, lost productivity, it adds up fast. So when people start leaving in patterns, leadership wants to know why. Maybe compensation has quietly fallen behind the market. Maybe a particular team or a particular manager has a turnover rate that's abnormally high compared to the rest of the organization. A well-run exit interview program is often just an early warning system, feeding aggregated data up to people who might actually be in a position to fix something. In bigger organizations, this data usually rolls up into a report that gets reviewed quarterly, sometimes even annually, by people well above your old manager's pay grade. Someone in HR analytics might be looking at things like average tenure by department, common reasons cited for leaving, or whether certain job levels are seeing higher churn than others. In theory, that's a healthy thing. Some turnover is normal, even expected, and companies generally understand that people leave for better opportunities, relocation, or simply because a role runs its course. What organizations are usually far more concerned about is unhealthy turnover, the kind that clusters around a specific team, a specific manager, or a specific pattern of complaints, because that's usually a sign something structural needs attention rather than something that can be chalked up to normal churn. And because that's the official purpose, most people walk into the room assuming it's harmless. It's framed as a conversation, sometimes even a friendly one. You're offered coffee. Someone asks open, casual questions. It doesn't feel like a formal document is being created. It feels like closure, like the last box to check before you walk out the door for good. Here's the part that often gets missed, though. In many organizations, whatever you say in that room doesn't just get compiled into some faceless quarterly report and forgotten. Often, it gets typed up, saved, and attached to your personnel file. The same file that exists if you ever apply to that company again, or if a hiring manager there happens to ask around informally about you before making an offer. That file doesn't disappear. In smaller organizations especially, where there isn't a polished third-party vendor running the process, this can be even more informal. A document that just sits on someone's desk or in a shared drive, available to whoever happens to go looking. So picture this. You've had a rough run at a job. Your manager never really listened to you. Promotions never came. You felt underpaid and undervalued for years. The exit interview finally feels like your moment. Someone is sitting across from you with a notepad, nodding along, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like someone in leadership actually wants to hear what's wrong. So you let it out. All of it. Every grievance, every slight, everything that built up over years of biting your tongue in one-on-ones. It feels good in the moment. It feels like justice, finally. But what you've actually done is create a written record of complaints tied permanently to your name, sitting in a file that exists specifically so people can reference it later. If you ever want to come back to that company, maybe a new team, a new manager, a role that pays significantly better, that file is often one of the first things someone will pull up. And if it's full of raw, unfiltered venting, you may have unintentionally moved yourself into the bucket of people who simply aren't getting a second look, regardless of how qualified you actually are for the new role. This matters more than people expect, because career paths are rarely as linear as they seem in the moment. People boomerang back to former employers far more often than most job seekers realize, sometimes because the market shifts, sometimes because a new leader comes in and rebuilds the team, sometimes because the grass wasn't quite as green as it looked. None of that is a problem in itself. The problem only shows up if the version of you sitting in that file is the angriest, least filtered version of yourself, frozen in time from a single bad week rather than the fuller picture of your actual performance and potential. Now, I want to be careful here, because there's a common piece of advice floating around that isn't quite accurate, and I don't want to add to the confusion. Some people worry that if a different company calls this employer for a reference check, someone is going to read off your exit interview complaints to them. Generally, that's not how it works. And honestly, it opens the original employer up to real legal risk if they did. In most reference check processes, companies are cautious about what they share for exactly this reason: liability. So the exit interview and the reference check tend to live in two very separate lanes. One is internal data collection. The other is a much more limited, controlled process. This isn't legal advice, just a pattern I've seen consistently. And employment law can vary quite a bit depending on where you are. So if you're ever genuinely unsure, it's worth a quick conversation with an employment attorney in your area rather than guessing. But there's another layer to this that almost nobody thinks about until it's too late, and it has less to do with what you actually say and more to do with who's asking the questions in the first place. So here are a few things worth paying attention to if you do decide to sit down for one of these. Who's actually conducting the interview can tell you something. If it's an outside third-party vendor whose entire job is aggregating anonymized data across hundreds of companies, the information is often folded into broader trend reporting and rarely tied back to you in a way that follows you personally. If it's someone from your own internal HR team, particularly someone fairly junior working off a standard script, the notes they take are more likely to end up filed directly with your employment record. It's also worth noticing the tone of the meeting itself. If it feels like a genuine, curious conversation about systemic issues, that's often a sign the company is actually trying to learn something. If it feels more like a formality, or if you're asked to sign or initial anything at the end, that's usually a signal to be a little more careful and a little more measured in how much you reveal. It's also worth paying attention to how specific the questions get. General Open-ended questions about your overall experience often point toward genuine trend gathering. Pointed questions about a specific manager's behavior, specific dates, or specific incidents can sometimes mean the company is already looking into something and gathering supporting documentation, which isn't necessarily bad for you, but it does mean your words may end up carrying more formal weight than a casual chat would suggest. None of these signals are absolute, and plenty of well-meaning HR teams simply follow a standard template regardless of intent. So treat these as things to notice rather than hard rules to rely on. So what should you actually do? First, understand that in most cases, this meeting is not mandatory. Companies generally can't force you to participate, and they typically can't withhold your final paycheck or take other adverse action against you simply because you decline. In most circumstances, it's voluntary. Full stop. Second, weigh what you actually stand to gain against what you stand to lose. In most cases, the upside of venting is purely emotional. It might feel good for 20 minutes. The downside, however small the odds, is a documented record that could follow you for years. If you're someone who's genuinely certain you'll never want anything to do with this employer again, not a returning role, not a reference, nothing, then you have a bit more room to be candid. And if you choose to use that moment to speak honestly, that's entirely your call to make. Just go in with clear eyes about who you're actually speaking to. Often, it's someone in HR who doesn't set policy and doesn't have the authority to change your old manager's behavior. Your words might genuinely get passed upward and contribute to real change eventually. They might also just sit in a file, unread, for years. If you do decide to participate, a more measured approach tends to serve people better in the long run. Keep feedback constructive and forward-looking rather than purely emotional. Frame concerns around specific, factual patterns rather than personal attacks. And if you're asked whether you'd consider returning in the future, it's usually fine to leave that door open even if you don't mean it in the moment, simply because you never know what circumstances might change down the road. One more thing worth doing: whether or not you participate in the official exit interview. Write your own private record of why you're leaving, for yourself, before memory softens or distorts it. Not for HR, not for anyone else. Just a factual, dated account of the patterns that led you to this decision. This protects you in a different way. It gives you an honest, unfiltered reference point you can look back on if you're ever tempted to romanticize a former employer. And it also helps you articulate your reasons for leaving clearly and professionally in future interviews, without the file that lives inside your old company's HR system shaping that story for you. It's also worth remembering that if your reasons for leaving genuinely come as a surprise to your manager or your organization, that's rarely a reflection on you. In a well-run department, this shouldn't come as a shock. Regular one-on-ones, honest check-ins, and a manager who's actually paying attention should mean your concerns were visible long before you ever handed in your resignation. If the business is only hearing about serious problems for the first time in an exit interview, that's often a sign of a bigger organizational gap, one that has very little to do with you and everything to do with how that team is actually being managed day to day. So should you skip the exit interview? Not necessarily out of fear, and not because there's some grand conspiracy waiting for you in that room. Most of the time, it really is just data collection, and most of the people running it are just doing their job. But it's worth walking in, or choosing not to walk in, with your eyes open. Know that what you say may live a lot longer than the meeting itself. Know that there's very little to gain and a small but real amount to lose. And know that the healthiest version of leaving a job is one where you protect your own future first and let the company handle its own turnover data on its own time. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually himself behind that closed door, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I break down these hidden workplace mechanics every single week. And I genuinely like to know, have you ever sat through an exit interview? And did you hold back or let it all out? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. And if you're already thinking about how to handle those final 2 weeks without burning a single bridge, that's exactly what I'm covering in the next video, so keep an eye out for it.